Welcome everyone, my name's Thea. I'm a workplace wellbeing advisor specialising in the wellbeing of midlife working women. So often training, education and consulting to workplaces to help them become menopause friendly. So these Menopause at Work network meetings, they're free quarterly events and they're designed to bring together workplace professionals who are interested in this area so we can learn from each other, so we can be inspired, we can learn about the latest research, which is what we're going to be doing today, and the latest practice. And so because it is a network meeting, we do start right up front with a short 4 to 5 minute hello with someone in a breakout room, just to say, hi, this is where I'm from and this is what got me here. Then we'll go on and introduce our two wonderful presenters today. So Professor Jo Brewis from the UK, who's going to give us an update on the latest and most relevant research in relation to menopause in the workplace. And then we've got Deborah Garlick, who has many, many years experience in helping workplaces practically become menopause friendly. She's the founder of Henpicked and Henpicked Menopause at Work. I'll introduce them more formally shortly, but how about we just jump straight into a breakout room and just say hello to someone. So if you just give me a moment here, I'm going to just open the breakout rooms and just roughly see how many we need. And you might have 2 or you might have 3, see how you go. And I'm literally going to give you 4 or 5 minutes just to say hi and where you're from, just as you would if we were meeting face to face. You know, you grab your coffee and then you go over and have a little bit of a chat to someone. So here we go. Oh, also an important point, at the bottom right hand side, there is a leave room button. If for whatever reason you ever need to use that, just let your partner know that you're just ducking out for a bit, and that's a way that you can exit. Also, this is the point where I'm just going to pause the recording. So now, you know, they use that expression, it gives me great pleasure to introduce blah, blah. Well, this actually does, because I just got to give you a little bit of a personal insight to Jo and Deborah. So at the end of 2018, that was when I identified that this was a massive gap in workplaces, discussions around menopause. And I thought, yes, something needs to be done. And I, had a few attempts, and of course, at that stage was met with fairly closed doors and a fair bit of resistance. And I came across Jo Brewis's report that she wrote for the UK government. And I also heard about Deborah's work in terms of actually doing training for managers in workplaces. And boldly, I just sent them an email, and just said, hi, how are you going? Can I have a meet up with you? And they both generously gave their time and were very supportive and gave me lots of encouragement. And I said, Thea, it will change. It will change. And so I'm really glad to have them back here 4 years later. And I can say actually 70 people registered for this webinar today, which back in 2018, I literally got about 5 people. So I'm really grateful for their support and their encouragement and sharing of information. And that's very much what the ethos of this network is about. So Jo is going to present first, then we'll have Deborah. And so if you've got any questions of Jo, if you could just jot them down, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So we've got a good 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. So I really encourage you to make the most of having these 2 women on board. So I'm going to introduce Jo Brewis first. As I mentioned, we'll give just a bit of a short update on the most recent and relevant research related to menopause. She's also got experience, applying it practically as well. And she's a professor of people and organisations in the Faculty of Business and Law at the Open University Business School in the UK. And she's co-author of a very influential report that was written in 2017. It's called The Effects of Menopause Transition on Women's Economic Participation in the UK. She's going to show you a little bit more about that. It's a fantastic collection of all the research, and I used it as a really helpful resource for quite a long time. But she's also a panel member of the UK's Menopause Friendly Accreditation scheme. So lovely to have you, Jo, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Thea, and good morning from the UK, good evening to everybody over there in lovely Australia. I am now going to attempt not to break the system by sharing my slides.
Got the utmost confidence in you.
I'm glad you have. I think you can all see that now.
Yes.
Okay. So that's my email if anybody would like to get in touch with me afterwards. And thanks so much, Thea, for having me along and such a welcoming and warm introduction. So first of all, I'm just going to give you a very, very brief overview of our government report. So we published this in 2017, and I co-wrote it with my friends and colleagues, Andrea Davies, Vanessa Beck and Jessie Matheson. We were commissioned by the Government Equalities Office in the UK to do what was called a systematic evidence review, and they wanted us to look at all of the good quality English language publications, starting from the beginning of 1990 through until the end of March 2016, because we were actually commissioned to start the work in January 16, and we managed to, at that point, cover everything up until the early spring. Once we'd done the sifting and the quality checks and made sure that what we were actually looking at was substantive, as opposed to just mentioning menopause at work very briefly, we ended up with 104 English language publications, and that included not just academic research, but high quality grey literature, as academics call it. In other words, that's not published by or in academic outlets, rather. It's much more public facing. It could come from professional bodies, it could come from trade unions, it could come from journalists, and so on and so forth. So the 5 key topics which we covered in the report were, first of all, and these were all questions that we were set by the Equalities Office, first of all, the big question of whether or not menopause is in fact an employment issue. Does it affect people's abilities not only to find jobs, but to stay in jobs? Does it affect whether or not people leave jobs early? Is it a factor in early retirement or perhaps redundancy, and so on? And the resounding answer to most of that, based on the evidence, was yes, it's very much something that can cause significant problems in some cases at work. Then the next question we were tasked to look at was the extent to which symptoms or clusters of symptoms had problematic effects at work, whether women's own attitudes made a difference, and also whether other people's attitudes made a difference to their experiences at work. I should add here as well that at this point in time, we weren't quite as, gosh, I'm struggling to think of the word, but I suppose the word is simply progressive, and we do refer to women throughout the report. We're a good deal more sensitive and careful these days. And now we recognise explicitly in everything that we do that menopause is not just something that cis women go through. In fact, it's an experience for numbers of transgender men and other gender non-conforming and non-binary people. The third topic that we examined was what employers could do to support menopausal people at work, because at that point, and I think Deborah used the phrase, and has used it quite frequently, employer support for menopausal staff was a bit like a unicorn. You know, you sometimes hear about it, but you're not really sure it exists, and it's extremely rare where it does exist. So we made recommendations in that space based on the evidence, and we also made recommendations for better government support. The fourth big question we were tasked to answer was, how much does menopause actually cost in pounds, shilling and pence? Use a rather old-fashioned piece of English vernacular. And the answer we came up with there was that actually at that point in time, it was well nigh impossible to count the costs accurately. We had some data, but they were all based on American studies. And of course, the US has a very different healthcare system and a very different national and regional culture from the ones that we would typically expect to see in the UK. And the extrapolations were just too difficult to do. We felt as academics that there was just too much guesswork involved. So we couldn't even come up with a rough estimate at that point. And then we finished on a series of evidence gaps. In other words, things that we still don't know very much about. And at the time, bearing in mind the evidence ran up to the end of March 2016, there was still quite a lot of evidence gaps at that point in time. And if anybody's interested, Sia has a copy of the slides, and there's a click link there where you can go straight through to the government report and download it for free. Okay. But I'm pleased to say that things have moved on considerably since then, at least in terms of academic research. So one of the things that we know a lot more about now than we did 5 or 6 years ago was that menopause interventions at work actually are successful, they are effective. So, for example, Claire Hardy and her colleagues have done numbers of studies into this particular issue. They have looked at online training for managers, which has proven to be very effective. They also looked at a self-help training manual that they put together, which guided women through CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, which is intended to help them manage menopause symptoms at work. Both of those proved very effective. The same is true of a package that Deborah et al. Put together for women working at a Dutch hospital who were actually in low-paid jobs. And this was a sort of work-life balance type intervention. But one of the things that came through very strongly was that it did have a very positive impact for the women involved. What we also see now is more diverse voices featured in the academic research about menopause at work. So 6-7 years ago, almost everything that we saw was featuring the work of middle-class, professional, cis women. And so it was an interesting picture that was being painted, but it wasn't terribly diverse. And one of the big missing features in this particular body of research was the voices of women who aren't in professional stroke managerial stroke well-paid occupations. And now we have much more of that. So I've already talked about Deborah et al. We also have work from my lovely friends Kat Riak and Gavin Jack, and they did a very extensive survey on and interviews as well on women working in hospitals and universities, many of whom are in these so-called lower skilled or lower status jobs, big inverted commas there. And more recently than that, we also have an interesting narrative literature review from Yoeli et al., who actually try and surface the voices of menopausal staff who are actually in precarious jobs. And that's a particularly interesting piece to read. We've also seen more acknowledgement that menopause as a workplace experience isn't always negative, it isn't always draining, it isn't always terrible. I really commend these two pieces just because they're a really good fun read apart from anything else. So the Jack et al. Piece from 2019 has some really quite inspiring accounts actually of how women felt more empowered, they felt more assertive, they felt that they couldn't be bothered, and I'm using a euphemism there, and the word used wasn't actually bothered. They weren't bothered about pleasing other people at work anymore. They just wanted to be themselves, and they wanted to support younger women who were coming up behind them as well and paving the way for those younger women to go through menopause at work themselves. Similar sorts of accounts from Butler, who did some interviews with a diverse group of women who were all working in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. And what we saw in the Butler piece was some really strong stories about how much solidarity and community these women had built up amongst themselves as a result of going through menopause together in a shared workplace. We now, and this research I think is groundbreaking, also have some reliable and valid statistics on the cost of menopause transition, particularly to women themselves. So both of these studies, Evan Drew et al. And Bryson et al., are based on the same longitudinal survey that's been happening in the UK for some years now. And what came out of their analysis of this research is that, first of all, if you have one severe menopause symptom at the age of 50, you are 43% more likely to have left work by the time you reach 55. You're also much less likely to be in work at all if you have either psychological symptoms of menopause or indeed if you go through early menopause. So those pieces of research I always describe as groundbreaking because they really have provided us with that concrete evidence that menopause is economically and socially very costly. Because the government report was particularly focused on the UK, one of the gaps that we identified at the time were there wasn't very much empirical research, in other words, research based on real world data, which came from the UK. And again, I'm pleased to say that's not the case anymore. So now we have a really much stronger evidence base here. We've got work that's been done using surveys, for example, some of the stuff that Claire Hardy and her colleagues have done. Belinda Stephan's done some lovely work with interviews. The Butler study that I referenced earlier on is also based on qualitative interviews. We have a range of different occupations. So Atkinson et al., their survey data is based on the police. Bodser et al., their survey data is based on very in-depth interviews with counsellors. And Stephan's research, her interviews were actually with women who worked in local government. So we are seeing some progress here, some considerable progress, actually, especially given that the evidence base was really quite small when we published the report. However, there are still a lot of gaps to fill. And one of the papers that I've published together with Vanessa and Andrea, and again, our friends and colleagues, Carol Atkinson and Jo Brewis, actually spends quite a lot of time outlining what we still need to know. And one of the things, and I know people in Australia will understand this perhaps even better than those in the UK, one of the things we really don't know anything about are intersectional experiences at work in terms of menopause. So, for example, how does gender interact with ethnicity in that regard? How might it interact with disability? How might it interact with whether or not you have children? How might different people with different genders or no gender identity at all actually experience the workplace? And so on and so on and so on. So there's still a lot that we need to know. That said, and this is a shameless plug, so forgive me, we've got, Vanessa and I have got an edited book coming out, hopefully later this year. We delivered the manuscript only 2 years late, just before Christmas. And there are 6 or 7 chapters in that book, many of them featuring some of the authors that I've already referenced here. And again, we're trying to move that literature forward. And there's new work coming out all the time, but there is still a lot to be done. And I just want to end by saying, first of all, that there's a list of references that follow these slides. And again, you can get the slides from Sia. But it's actually the case now, and has been for some years, thanks in the main to the fantastic efforts of Deborah and her team at Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace and the Menopause Friendly Accreditation. Activity in workplaces in the UK at least is far, far ahead of academic research. So with that, I will hand over to Deborah.
Thank you so much for that really pithy summary, Jo, and I really look forward to reading a bit more about the empirical studies and also the ones highlighting the positive experience, because we often hear is the bad news about menopause. So thank you, that was really helpful, and I will send out a copy of the slides when we also send out recordings. That's really generous of you. Thank you so much. So jot down your questions, but I'm now going to hand over and introduce Deborah Garlick. And Deborah is the CEO of the UK's Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace. And she's also author of a book called Menopause, The Change for Better. And her team have been working with organisations across the UK and also internationally to help them introduce the right kind of training or education or policies to support women. And in 2021, she supported the launch of the Menopause Friendly membership and accreditation. So I'm really busting to hear a bit more about this accreditation and what kind of standards workplaces actually have to attain to get the tick. So thank you again so much, Deborah, for making time, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Taryn. It's great to meet everyone. Thank you, Jo, for that recap on all of the reasons why all of that research that's available to demonstrate from an academic point of view, but actually there's a lot of pound signs in there that help people understand why menopause in the workplace is so urgent and important. And I feel from that, because I was with Jo actually on the day that that government report was published, and it was absolutely groundbreaking. It resulted in headlines that we'd never seen before, things like the UK is losing millions every year because bosses don't get menopause. Now, as Jo said, we'd already started doing work in workplaces, and very well, right at the beginning of the year that before that report was published, we had a Menopause in the Workplace conference here in the UK with some very, very influential employers that came along, who then became the case studies that helped us identify and recognise, well, if this is the problem, What is it that employers can do? What are the key things that will change the way everyone thinks and feels about the menopause in the workplace? And one thing, I'm not going to do my usual hours worth of this is menopause, these are the ages, stages, symptoms and solutions. That's very unusual for me. But I do think it's important to flag a couple of things when we're talking about menopause, because menopause, it's always been around. As long as there've been women on this earth, and they've lived long enough, there's been the menopause. But actually, we're living in a very, very different time now. You know, if we go back in time 100 years ago, women tended to experience menopause around 57 and died at 59. Now, those statistics are average and a little bit rough because of the data that's available. But when you think about the environment that we're in now, we're working for longer, we're living for longer, and menopause hits at a time that is, you know, it could be at the peak of our career, will certainly be in the middle of our careers. So it's important to understand that, because I always reference that actually our mindset hasn't changed. Whilst the statistics have changed, our mindset hasn't changed. And we often see things around menopause being a taboo subject. It's less taboo now in the UK since well, probably over the last 5 years in particular, but it is still a sensitive subject. And I think before I talk about menopause friendly, I would like to just highlight that in the context of everyone's experience of menopause is very, very different, whether that's their symptoms, their mindsets, their personal philosophies on how they manage symptoms. And when Jo and I say, let's talk about menopause, that's pretty easy for us to say. We talk about very little else. But for some people, it's a real sensitive subject that it really is difficult for them to even utter the word. And they certainly might not want to describe their experience of it. And, you know, data after data, and you'll find that in Jo's research, what we found was people saying, I don't want to talk to my line manager about this. This is not something that I think I can change. I can talk about menopause at work. So when you start to understand that context of everyone is different and it is still a taboo subject, it starts to highlight the challenge that we're working to change. We want to change everyone's hearts and minds around the menopause. And actually our experience is when you do that, it changes things for today. And it also changes things for generations to come. So that's the mission, but it's always worth appreciating and not making assumptions. And Jo mentioned about this being an inclusive subject. I think that's something we've learned a lot about in the last 7 years, Jo, along the way. That people think, and I often hear people saying menopause affects half of the workforce. Well, actually, it doesn't. It affects all of us. It affects half of us firsthand, and the rest of us through our relationships, whether that's with a partner, family member, friend, colleague. We all need to know about menopause. And one of the other interesting things is because this is not a sheep dip exercise where everything every employer does needs to be the same, because all workplaces are different too, whether that's their culture, their leadership style, you know, the difference between an office worker and a factory worker and a shop worker, that all needs to be taken into account. And also geographical locations. We have some employees who are spread worldwide. So their response and how they support their colleagues is different. Now, I do feel like I'm fast forwarding a lot, Taya, since our first conversations in 2018, because actually workplaces have really, so many inspirational workplaces have really embraced menopause in the workplace, awareness, education and support. And this is our Menopause Friendly membership and accreditation is actually 2 years old now. And the reason that we launched this membership was because we were working with so many employers. And one of the things that we identified, knowing the difference, was that actually employers also like to collaborate. So I was talking to Libby earlier in the breakout room, and the concept of the membership was, whilst every employer's response to this may be different, the key elements are the same. And those key elements tend to be, well, I'll come on to those shortly, the types of things that menopause friendly membership, independent panel members look for in a great application. Whilst every employer's response may be different, membership is really helpful in enabling them not to start from scratch. You know, whilst they're different, you can take inspiration. So, for example, within the membership, we have a wonderful library of policies, guidance documents, and we would run every month a workshop on how to write your menopause policy and guidance in the membership. And that enables organizations, it makes it easier for them. So they do like to collaborate, and they collaborate very well. So in the workshops, you'll see all sorts of different employers. The membership also provides resources. So as talking to Libby earlier, one of the things that we do know is a lot of organizations are very time poor on this, and a lot of people are doing it side of desk. So in the membership, people get 3 kits of parts, 3 communication kits every year to say, actually, let's keep the conversation going. And I know we've got the International Women's Day pack out there at the moment, ready to spread across all of our member organizations and all of those different workplaces. So the membership was born to make it easier for employers to understand what best practice looks like, but also to support them throughout their journey. And then when they're ready, they can go for accreditation. So the 4 steps we often talk about is step 1, when members join, they are allowed to display the badge that they are committed to being menopause friendly. That is a big signal to people in their organisation. Step 2 and 3 is going through the workshops, shaping their response, making sure menopause is embedded into the fabric of their organisation. And the scoring we tend to do is based on a 1 to 5 system, and 4 and 5 are, if you like, the scoring zones, where 4 is actually this is integrated in the organisation, and 5 is we believe that this is so sustainable that it won't roll back. Even if the project leads in that organisation leave that organisation, the work will still continue, the conversations and the support will continue. So it's proved to be a very, very interesting 2 years. And I know I sent a note to our independent panel. We get together once a year and we review the standards to say, of all of the employers that we've accredited, what's new? Is the standard still the same? Do we need to change any of those standards? Just so that we can make sure it's calibrated for a way that makes the membership and accreditation very meaningful, but achievable and genuinely helpful. Now, without going through, Taya, the step-by-step, and it's a huge document actually that we've put together for our independent panel to say this is what we're all looking for, so that we can all make sure that we're working from the same page on that. But the 5, I've simplified it into 5 things that we tend to look for in an employer being accredited as menopause friendly. And the first one, I'm going to say policy. Now, it's not law in the UK to have a menopause policy, but it is good practice. And the reason it's good practice is because it makes it clear to everyone in that organisation that menopause is important to the organisation. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a policy. Now, some of the things that the independent panel look for, and I don't know about in Australia, but certainly in the UK, I think I see quite a lot of things that say, download your menopause policy. These standards are not tick boxes. They appreciate that all individuals, all different roles are unique within organisations, and for that matter, employers are unique too. So what we look for in a policy is that it's embedded in the organisation. It's not a dusty document that somebody's downloaded off an internet and change the name and put in a filing cabinet. It's how it's brought to life that is important. You need to make sure it's readily accessible. So if somebody, if I'm experiencing symptoms and don't know what to do about it, can I go to the web intranet and say, type in menopause, and it pops the policy that tells me this organisation or my organisation takes this seriously, and this is the support that I can expect. And is it regularly communicated is key as well, because what we've found is menopause being a sensitive subject, you communicate it and you send out your policy once, it won't change the culture and the behaviours, and for that matter, some people's mindset on whether it's okay to talk about menopause without feeling embarrassed or worrying about what others might think of you. So do keep the communication going. And one of the things I know Jo is very passionate about is that policy isn't a standalone policy, that it's integrated in whatever the organisation already has in place. And engagement, I could say communication and engagement, but this is the part about bringing menopause policy to life. And for that matter, breaking down that barrier of menopause feeling like it's a taboo subject, and appreciating that some might find it easier than others. But we know we don't change mindsets overnight. We know it takes time. So what the panel tend to look for is menopause being communicated around about 3 times a year. And there's some key dates on that one. International Women's Day tends to be a time a lot of organisations choose to talk about menopause. Women's Health Week here in the UK in May. And of course, World Menopause Day. So are they keeping the drumbeat going? Where can people find information about menopause very, very easily? And are the organisation encouraging conversations? So a lot, and Libby mentioned earlier in our breakout group, are starting support groups, are enabling people to feel that they're not on their own in this journey, whether that's for them or for a partner or somebody else that they're supporting. And training, of course, is key. Now, 2 questions we always ask at the beginning of our training sessions. What do you know about menopause and how confident do you feel to talk about it? 2 very interesting questions, actually, because very often when we say, how much do you know about it, you get a lot of feedback in the chat that says, I don't really know what I don't know, so I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I know what I've read in the papers. Is that accurate? And confident to talk about it. Line managers are not born with menopause knowledge. And we often hear from them that they feel worried that they might offend somebody, worried about how they open up that conversation. But actually, with the right training plan, not just going in and training the colleagues, but thinking about occupational health, thinking about HR, thinking about your line managers and thinking about your colleagues. And ideally in that structured approach, we often say, think about the colleague experience in this. Yes, we could run a colleague session, but what happens when that colleague goes away from that session and puts a meeting in with their line manager to say, I'd like to talk to you about my menopause, and that line manager has had no skills training, doesn't know where to start, and may feel completely blindsided by that. So a really strong structured approach. And what we're seeing now with our members and the applications for accreditation is how that training is integrated within an organisation. So adding training to induction programmes, it's a good news story, this one. It's one of those things where employers are saying from day one, this is something that we consider to be important when they're inducting colleagues into their organisation. And actually, one of the things that went live in June 2021 is that we saw the very first, and this was a menopause friendly accredited employer, advertise for staff with a banner across the bottom that says, we're an accredited menopause friendly employer. Now, as a menopausal woman, I know that I would consider that to be a reason for working for them and an indicator that they are a great place to work. And the support, what support do you offer? Now, often employers start from the basis of, we don't do anything for our colleagues that are experiencing the menopause. But when we start to investigate that, or we encourage them to investigate that through our workshops, to say, actually, what do you already offer? Have you got an employee assistance program? Have you got occupational health? Have they been trained on menopause? And what's really interesting is, because employers have been asking for this of their employee assistance program providers, that they've now added the menopause support to their menu of services that they're offering. And it's by exception now that EAP providers don't provide, for example, counselling support for those experiencing menopause. And the environment, again, 2 questions that we encourage people to think about from the environmental perspective. And I think this is throughout all of these programs, the best employers are the ones that demonstrate they're asking their colleagues what's going on, and they're listening and putting action in place. I'll highlight that the environment, we tend to say, ask 2 important questions. What's getting in the way of you being at your best at work, and what will help you? And the reason it's important to start from that perspective is, for example, we had one employer that applied for Menopause Friendly Accreditation. The other 4 elements along there were absolutely fine. In fact, some great stuff going on. But in one of the photographs they'd included as evidence, what they'd actually said, or they put a photograph, and it was of somebody wearing a uniform. And one of the panel members said, wonder what that uniform's made of. And the employee said, well, we've never had complaints about it, so it's absolutely fine. And the panel said, well, have you actually asked? And this was a really important one, because when the employers did ask, colleagues, the feedback came in hard and fast that said, the uniform is a nightmare. It's made of fabric that doesn't breathe. When I have a hot flush, the heat has nowhere to go, and I finish my days feeling hot and sweaty. And it was so easy to change that uniform working with the provider, that really did make a significant difference to employees in that workplace. So there, if you like, key elements of what the panel look for, Taya. But what I would say is, and again, this is highlighting the individual experiences, workplaces are different. And this is not a tick box exercise. What the panel are looking for fundamentally is, how have you changed the lived experience of somebody with menopause in your workplace? And they look for evidence, they look for impact and outcome, not just the, I've done my policy, tick, job done. They would look at it and say, and how is it being used? How are you bringing it to life? Have you got examples of where people have looked for reasonable adjustments? Now, so that is a key, the key elements that they look for. And one of the things that I think Jo and I, as Jo is an independent panel member for Menopause Friendly, are really inspired by is the responsive workplace, the difference this makes. And in every application, and I know Jo touched on the research, but in every application, when we ask for evidence, we see so many employees, people saying the difference this has made to my life. I was considering leaving work, and I am so grateful to my employer for all they've done for me, both in terms of the education and the support. So nice of you, Jo, to put that last bullet point on, because I think actually the culture around menopause in the UK is changing. And one of the things that I feel particularly proud of is looking at those inspirational employers who are actually contributing to that cultural change in the UK and making a difference to so many people's lives. So this is a real fast forward. This is 2 years old now, and it is seen as the kite mark and the symbol of excellence in Menopause Friendly in the UK. But this has been quite a journey. You know, I know we talked in 2018, Taya. I think Jo and I were starting to work on this in 2015, but I would credit the membership as enabling escalation of this across all workplaces. And that is very much because the membership are they demonstrate such camaraderie. And we often see people saying, well, actually, I've got one of that I got one of those, or this is what we did. These are the results that we've seen. Would you like me to share materials? So it enables everything to go that much faster. To the point of last year, September, we held our very first Menopause Friendly Employer Awards in the UK. Who'd have thought we'd have been able to do that back in 2018? As Jo said, we couldn't find, well, we used to refer to it as a mythical unicorn. People used to say, well, I think such and such does this, or I'm pretty sure that employer supports their colleagues during the menopause. But actually, you know, we just couldn't find those. But last year at the Menopause Friendly Employer Awards, we gave out 10 awards, including the Menopause Friendly Employer of the Year. And the buzz in that room was absolutely phenomenal. So we're going to be doing it again. And we were overwhelmed with the quality and number of employers that applied for those awards as well. So I guess this might be Australia at some point in the future, but I would certainly recommend it in terms of the membership and accreditation. Employers like a badge. They like to demonstrate the good work they're doing. They like to talk about it. And of course, that is benefiting everybody in that organisation. So I know I've got a video, entirely up to you, Taya, if I play that, or perhaps at the end. But you know, for me, this is a signal of actually there's been some significant change in the UK, and this is a big symbol of it's working.
Yeah, I reckon it'll be a really lovely send-off if we can end with the video. And if I can maybe just throw to the audience now. So thank you. That was just packed with really helpful, practical information. And I love the way you chunked it down into those 5 areas. And my key takeaway was, I love this. The key thing you're looking for is how have you changed the experience of someone, you know, who's going through menopause. That's really going to stick in my mind. And yeah, if you see those websites up there that Deborah's just put up, there's lots of really great articles in there. But I'd really love to hand over to our participants tonight. And if you have a question, you can either pop it in the chat box or just put your hand up. And if you'd like to speak, I always love hearing live voices, I'll just give you the nod. So heaps there to think about. Has anyone got some comments or questions they'd like to throw in? You've answered all their questions, Deborah. Well, look, while I'm keeping an eye on that, one that I've got is one of the kind of challenges I've been experiencing relates to just how long the list is of all the issues that wellbeing or D&I or HR practitioners are meant to be addressing these days. You know, everything from domestic violence, bullying, ageism, disability, gender stuff. And sometimes it can feel like, oh, this is just one more thing to add to our big list. The way I try to overcome that is just say, look, it's not a niche issue. You're talking about, you know, half your workforce, potentially, half the population, that it does teach transferable skills in how to have sensitive conversations around women's health. And I also point to, in Australia, there's been increased legislation around having to address the psychosocial risks. That's my attempt. But how do you come up against this, and how do you overcome that? You know, almost like, oh my God, it's another issue that I have to take on. It's all too much. I'll come to you, Laura, next. That question.
Do you want to go, Deborah, and then I can bring up the rear?
Sorry, Jo, I missed that.
Do you want to answer that first, and I'll bring up the rear?
Oh, I'm sorry, Taya. I thought you were asking it of everybody around how they balance all of the things that, because you're absolutely right. There are so many things on an employer's priority list, not least running the business and doing whatever it is, the services that they're doing. And one of the things that we've seen is that many people are doing menopause awareness, education and support. And as Libby was saying earlier to me, you know, you've got little groups of people that are doing those within their organisation from a support point of view. But I would probably focus on that as, you know, and I know, Jo, you and I might be a little bit biased on this one, This is urgent and important because of the number of people that are experiencing the menopause and the number of people that are affected by it. And I would say probably our 7 years of experience would say this is so popular. I know when we first ran the first conference, one of the first questions was, how do you get people talking about menopause? And we said, talk about menopause. You'll be surprised who joins in. And that has been the experience. One of the first employers that held a training session in their organisation were expecting around about 30 people to attend. And within a day of it being advertised in their workplace, they had to work out how 100 people were going to get into that same room. And they continue to do it and continue to do it. So it is incredibly popular because it's on so many people's minds and they're just waiting for this. It's an open door. But also the benefits that we've seen that people experience. So for me, that would be where it sort of prioritizes. And if you're thinking about, is it something that you need to consider as a priority? I'd say ask your colleagues. Dip your toe in the water and say, is this something that you want us to focus on in this organisation, and go from there. The big ears and listening on that have demonstrated to us that from a colleague perspective, it's very often jumped right to the top.
I can just quickly comment on the back of that as well, Thea. I think what you and Deborah said is absolutely right, that the sheer demographics tell us that this is urgent and important. But there are 3 other really pressing reasons why I think employers do need to be paying attention to this. And as you rightly say, it's often led by HR, whether it's under the mantle of EDI or wellbeing or perhaps health and safety in some cases. But the first reason is legislative protection, and you guys have got similar protection in Australia. In fact, your protection is stronger than ours legally. But in the UK already, there have been 5 successful employment tribunals, which are either wholly or in part based on menopause. And the numbers coming every year to tribunal are going up and up and up. So there's legal issues there in terms of actual financial damage and, of course, reputational cost. There are also very good business reasons to put this in place, and a lot of those are to do with brain drain. So if we take Evan Drew and Bryson seriously, and I think that we should, we've got hard evidence that people who are struggling with their symptoms are leaving work in their numbers, and with them walks out all the knowledge, all the wisdom, all the experience. And then finally, and as a bleeding heart, woolly liberal, I think this is the most important one. We just think it's the right thing to do, in the same way that no employer worth their salt nowadays would consider not having something in place to support people who are pregnant or people who've recently had babies. We think the same is true of menopause. And of course, not everybody who can biologically either carries or gives birth to a child. Everybody who has a particular type of biology will go through menopause. So I think there are some very strong arguments, not to necessarily say that menopause is the only issue in this space, because all of the other things that you mentioned are equally important, but that doesn't mean it should get lost in the shuffle. And I think sometimes whataboutery gets in the way, and we need to try and balance and juggle all of these different issues, which is, as you also rightly said, Thea, a lot of what's done in one space, so mental health is a really good example, can simply be transposed into another space, e.g. menopause. I can see there's lots of other questions coming in, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, so I can see 5 there. So I've got Felicity, Laura, Tamara and Peggy. So Felicity first asks, is there a common theme of the businesses applying for accreditation? And Felicity, by that, do you mean, is there a particular type of industry that is more represented? Is that what you meant there?
Yes, that's correct. Just if there was any sort of theme about, are they larger organisations, smaller organisations? Is there a particular industry in particular?
I would say absolutely not. Anybody that employs people are getting involved in this. So if I look at the accreditations from this year alone, we're just about to announce a Premier League football club, which of course is predominantly, I know I can't tell you which one it is, the press release isn't out yet, Jo. A Premier League football club is going live with their press release this week. The first employer to be accredited was a charity, We have organisations from the sort of the mega large, like Unilever, Bristol Myers Squibb, HSBC UK were the first employer to be accredited.
Wow.
But also we have care and services. I mean, I'm thinking of a smaller charity who work all care homes, and they found it hugely impactful to go through the process through the membership, but then they really do display their badge with pride. So it's all employers are getting involved in this. And, when we say employers are unique, when you say absolutely, you have to shine a light on all corners in your organization to achieve the accreditation. And, for some of them, that's, for some of them, that is actually international and all sorts of different places. But I would just say the only thing that is similar is they all employ people. Male-dominated employers seem to be trending right now as well, which is counterintuitive, because so many people think, oh, actually, this organisation is 70-odd% female, we must have it. But it's great to see the likes of BAE Systems achieving accreditation, predominantly male. Balfour Beatty, the construction industry, have achieved accreditation in the UK. So no, I think it's whether it's male dominated, female dominated, large, small, public sector, private sector, they're all taking inspiration from each other and looking at those key areas. Their approach might be different. The outcome they're experiencing is the same. It's a win-win. It's good for colleagues and it makes good business sense as well. And as you say, Jo, people aren't doing this really from a legal perspective. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Deborah. Great to hear about that enormous diversity. I'll go to Laura and then Peggy.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deborah, and to Jo and to Taya for hosting this. I've picked up loads. I deliver menopause awareness to organisations, and what I found very interesting was about what you said, Deborah, about the fact that people are having policies or they're having training, but maybe they're only just doing one session and then they're not carrying it on, and so it kind of just gets sort of forgotten about, and how we can change that. And then talking about your membership, I'm just wondering, is that something that I could tag on to my services to push them towards your membership? Because I think it would be, is that something that we could talk about, or is that something that you have to provide all the training for and then they would go into the membership? How would that work?
Well, no, we don't do all of the training for all of our members. The independent panel are independent. So some of the people that have achieved accreditation have done it with our help, as in Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace. They've done it themselves, or, we don't mind where they've done it. What we're looking for is the impact and the difference it's made from an accreditation perspective. And you're right, but one of the things that the membership has done is it's changed people's mindsets. We would have had people saying to us before, oh yes, we do this, we do menopause in our workplace. They say, well, what have you done? And they've done colleague work training, and they think that's made the difference. It really won't on its own. They do need to consider all of the things from policy, engagement, the support, all of those as part of it. And that's actually where they realize the benefits. That is the thing that's going to make the change for good. So no, all sorts of organizations might do some elements of the training, and they don't need to necessarily have the training from the organization that runs the Menopause Friendly membership. That is completely independent. It's more important to know they've done it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Peggy, put your hand up for a while.
Thank you both, Jo and Deborah, for tonight. I represent the Family Friendly Workplaces certification in Australia. So very similar, working with progressive organisations to make sure that they have family-friendly policies, practices, culture, leadership, measurement. So my question to you from an accreditation point of view, and you've talked about the impact, how do you measure the impact of the accredited organisations against organisations that are not accredited? So how do you explain the ROI and then measure the impacts organizations that are members or accredited, how do you what's the impact on retention, attraction, any, I assume there is a cost to get the accreditation, so the ROI on the cost. How do you package all of that?
I think, Jo, that might be one I ask you around, because I know it's very early days in terms of measuring success. Some things are easier to measure. Some things take a long time, and I'll let Jo answer some of that, because I know one of the things that we're trying to do is track that, things like retention, etc. Do we do a lot of research on what non-accredited members do? Not really, because there's so many organisations. We focus on the ones that are going for accreditation. But when I said it's not a tick box exercise, what the independent panel, of which Jo is a member of, look for is the difference this has made. So we rely on the employer doing their own surveys, putting together their case for change. This is the difference it's made. For example, some of the things employers might include in their evidence is, it's all right having a policy, it's all right saying that people can have extra uniforms as part of this to be to support their colleagues. How many uniforms have you issued during this time? How many people have asked for reasonable adjustments that never asked for those before, that were relating to menopause? How many people attended this training, and how does that reflect on other training that you've done? How many people are making clicks on the policy? You know, I'm thinking of one NHS organisation who included in their evidence that their CEO opened their annual conference by saying, "Hi, I'm a menopausal woman. I'm experiencing extreme hot flushes. I feel like I've got brain fog today, and I also feel very fat." Now, in your wildest dreams, I cannot imagine an NHS CEO opening that conference in that way. It was, and that actually gave people, that was a signal that said anybody can talk about this. If the top boss is talking about it and owning up to her symptoms, and we all think she's a high performer, then anybody can talk about it. So it's those sorts of evidence things that we look for. And many organisations, we encourage them to do a benchmark survey, and then we'll ask them to survey again, and we see how things have moved. Was there anything extra you wanted to add in there as a panel member, Jo?
Just super quickly, yes, I think everything that Deborah said is right. I think the baseline, so sort of taking the temperature, as I always say, before the intervention starts, and then doing an evaluation regularly, actually, I would argue, maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, to see how much is stuck. What I would say, though, Peggy, is in terms of ROI, that's a really interesting question. There are a lot of things, as Deborah's already suggested, that employers already do, which could be banded together somewhere on the intranet and made public as support that menopausal staff can avail themselves of. So, for example, in the UK, and I'm delighted to say that our really lovely government, I use the term loosely, have finally woken up to the fact that we need to be able to request flexible working as a day one employment right. At the moment, you have to have been employed with the same place for 6 months to ask for that. And it's not an entitlement to get it, but it's an entitlement to ask, and there has to be a good reason why not. But many, many, many employers are very happy to receive requests for flexible work. And flexible work is something that we know helps menopausal staff, especially when they've had a bad night's sleep, or they're having a particularly symptomatic day. COVID's taught us a lot about working from home, etc., etc. So sometimes it's just a matter of bundling everything together and signalling this very clearly as things that menopausal staff can also avail themselves of. I would also say that while some of the changes are expensive, you know, not going to lie, some of these do cost money and they can take a long time to bed in, but some are super simple. So, for example, buying people who get very easily distracted by noise because of their menopausal lack of concentration, hands up at this end, buy them a pair of noise cancelling headphones if they work in an open plan office. If somebody's working in an open plan office and there are issues with temperature, and we know that that's a real sticking point in a lot of places, buy them a USB desk fan. You know, these things are so cheap. And And also, as Deborah rightly says, and we see this everywhere, even tiny steps that an employer makes, even starting to open up the conversation, we have seen will reap enormous dividends. But I think in terms of evidence, and Deborah said it already, the best kind of evidence is both quantitative in the form of numerical data and qualitative in the sense of actually delving down a bit more deeply into how people's experiences have changed as a result of menopause intervention.
Awesome, thank you for that. So just so you know, we do allow this session to run to 1/4 that hour, and at that point I'll check in with our presenters because they may need to dash off, and if so, we really want to see Deborah's lovely video. I've got time for one more question, and this is a good one, and it relates to, it's from Felicity. Would you consider chemopause to be included in this type of policy or under chronic illness? So I imagine she's referring to there, if for example we have something like breast cancer and the treatment involves having to take medication which plunges you into medical menopause, and you're then dealing with, you know, often more severe and abrupt symptoms. Have either of you, Jo or Deborah, got a comment about that, about where it lies? Go, Jo. You've got your hand up.
Go, Jo.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also thank you for teaching me a new word. I've never seen chemopause before, but that's well, it's not brilliant, it's horrible, but it's a really neat way to describe it. I think this is an example actually of how things that are either already in place or things that can be put in place to support menopausal workers will benefit a whole range of others. Okay, and I won't drone on about that because we're very short of time, but I would say that there are particular kinds of leave that people who are struggling with menopausal symptoms, whatever the cause, whether it's natural menopause or whether it's something like chemotherapy or having had your ovaries removed, however your menopausal symptoms have come about, whether they're temporary or permanent, what we see is that people who have those symptoms tend to need to take particular types of absence, and it's the kind of absence that often triggers performance reviews. So I don't know if Australia has been visited by the Bradford score. Is that something that you guys use? I'm seeing shaking heads and blank expressions. Well, the Bradford score is basically something that's used very frequently in the UK, and it's a sort of performance indicator. I won't go into the details, but basically the kind of absence that people who suffer with menopausal symptoms will take will often mean that your Bradford score gets very, very, very high indeed very quickly, and that will trigger a performance intervention. So these absences tend to be relatively short term, but they're also erratic, but they can be reasonably frequent. So you might want 2 days here, 3 days there, 4 days in a few weeks' time. And it's those sorts of absences which sick leave policies often start tipping over very quickly into performance management. So what we would argue is that any form of absence policy should have something in it to cover those sorts of absences where it is badged as an ongoing health and well-being issue, rather than something that gets you hauled in front of your manager for not being at work, according to whatever the particular absence culture is there. So I think that, you know, that sort of chemopause, if you like, can be part of a sick leave policy, but I would argue that those sorts of symptoms need to be treated very sensitively.
I also think, Jo, one of the things we look at from a training perspective, and we often see this, so just busting a myth here, we often see the phrase menopause is a natural stage in a woman's life. There are so many things that statement doesn't stand. Now, it's not, it might be a stage in life, but for many people it is not a natural stage. So surgical menopause, induced menopause, for example, need to be included in training. What we're looking at are symptoms as a result of significant hormonal change. And whilst training focus on menopause, interventions for those that are experiencing cancers or surgery, for example, hysterectomy, oophorectomy, are very important to include because the symptoms are very much the same. And actually, for line managers in particular, it's a key trigger if somebody says, I'm taking time off for a hysterectomy, or I'm struggling with breast cancer, which is estrogen receptive, to perhaps appreciate that those hormonal fluctuations could cause a lot of difficulty when that individual returns to work. So that really is a trigger for, we need to have a conversation about this, and I need to understand how I can support you.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Jo. This has been such a value-packed session for me, and I hope it has for everyone on the line. What we might do is we might formally wrap up, but I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes if anyone does have any other questions. But I know that these people are just at the start of their day. But just before that, just wanted to let you know that I'm running a manager training, a public one, on March the 28th. So this can be where you get people from different workplaces rather than an in-house session. And the value of this can be that cross-fertilisation, but also maybe you're not ready to roll out a full manager training for all your staff, but you do want key personnel brought up to speed, maybe the HR or work health and safety people. So it's an opportunity to also, taste it as well. And then that person can become a resource for the organisation. So that's on March 28th. If any of you are interested, you can just drop me an email. Bit of a discount if you enrol by the end of February. So that's my plug. Huge thank you to Deborah and Jo. Really great to see you. And let's go out with your video, shall we?
If you'd like to. Wonderful to meet you all. And I wish you every success in raising the awareness of menopause at work. I mean, it does make such a difference. So we're cheering everybody on. And
yeah,
I will
for having us, guys.
This may feel a bit left field, but this to me is would have been in our wildest dreams, Jo, in 2017. Am I sharing?
Not yet. So
okay, so let me just try that again.
Sure.
Here we go. There you go.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for inviting us, Taya.